Margaret Williams had worked for the Henderson family for 23 years. She started when she was just 19 years old, fresh from her small hometown in Alabama. The grand mansion on Beacon Hill in Boston seemed like another world to her back then. The marble floors gleamed under crystal chandeliers, and every room held treasures worth more than most people earned in a lifetime. Robert Henderson was different from other wealthy men Margaret had encountered. While his business associates often treated her like she was invisible, Robert always greeted her with genuine warmth. He asked about her family, remembered her children's names, and even helped pay for her daughter's college education when times got tough. Margaret watched him build his empire from a successful real estate company into a billion-dollar corporation that owned properties across 3 continents. The Henderson household ran like clockwork under Margaret's careful management. She knew every corner of the mansion, every habit of the family, and every visitor who came through their doors. Robert's wife Elizabeth was kind but distant, often traveling to charity events and social gatherings. Their 2 children, Michael and Sarah, grew up under Margaret's watchful eye almost as much as their parents. Margaret took pride in her work. She arrived every morning at 6 sharp, prepared breakfast exactly how each family member liked it, and ensured every detail of their daily life ran smoothly. The other staff respected her, and the family trusted her completely. She had keys to every room, knew the combination to the safe, and was privy to many private family conversations. Over the years, Margaret witnessed Robert's struggles with business rivals who envied his success. She observed late-night phone calls, tense meetings in his study, and the strain that constant pressure put on his shoulders. Despite his wealth, Robert worked harder than anyone she knew. He often stayed up until dawn reviewing contracts and making deals that would secure his family's future. The trouble began on a rainy Tuesday morning in March. Margaret arrived at work to find police cars surrounding the mansion. Officers were questioning the staff, searching through rooms and treating the family home like a crime scene. Robert sat in his study, his usually confident demeanor replaced by confusion and worry. Elizabeth clutched their daughter Sarah, who was home from college for spring break. Detective Patricia Morrison, a stern woman with sharp eyes, explained to Margaret that Robert Henderson was being investigated for financial fraud. Someone had accused him of stealing millions of dollars from investors through fake real estate deals. The detective asked Margaret dozens of questions about Robert's habits, his visitors, and any suspicious activities she might have noticed. Margaret's heart sank as she listened to the allegations. They painted Robert as a greedy criminal who had built his fortune by deceiving innocent people. According to the charges, he had created fake property developments, sold shares to investors, and then disappeared with their money. The prosecution claimed he had been running this scheme for over 5 years. As days turned into weeks, Margaret watched the investigation consume the Henderson family. Reporters gathered outside their home, taking pictures and shouting questions whenever anyone entered or left. Robert's business partners distanced themselves from him, and longtime friends stopped returning his calls. The stress aged him visibly, and Margaret worried about his health. The media coverage was brutal. Newspapers ran headlines calling Robert Henderson a master manipulator who had stolen the life savings of hard-working families. Television news programs featured interviews with supposed victims who claimed they had lost everything because of his lies. Public opinion turned against him quickly, with many people assuming his guilt before any trial began. Margaret knew something was wrong with the entire situation. In all her years working for the Henderson family, she had never seen Robert act dishonestly. He treated his business dealings with the same integrity he showed in his personal life. When contractors overcharged for work on the mansion, Robert always paid fairly but made sure they corrected any problems. When staff members made mistakes, he addressed issues directly, but never with cruelty. The housekeeper began paying closer attention to the details of the case. She read every newspaper article and watched every news report, trying to understand how Robert could be accused of such terrible crimes. The more she learned, the more convinced she became that someone was setting him up to take the blame for crimes he did not commit. Margaret remembered conversations she had overheard between Robert and his business partner, James Crawford. Crawford had always seemed nervous around Robert, especially when discussing their joint ventures. She recalled seeing Crawford at the mansion late at night, going through Robert's files when the family was away. At the time, she assumed Robert had given him permission, but now those memories took on new significance. The evidence against Robert seemed overwhelming to everyone else, but Margaret noticed inconsistencies that others missed. Documents that supposedly proved his guilt contained signatures that looked different from his usual handwriting. Dates on contracts did not match Margaret's careful records of Robert's travel schedule. Phone records showed calls made from Robert's office when Margaret knew he was in meetings elsewhere. As Robert's legal team prepared for trial, Margaret made a decision that would change everything. She could not stand by and watch an innocent man be destroyed by lies. Despite the risk to her own reputation and livelihood, she decided to investigate the matter herself. She had access to information that lawyers and detectives did not, and she knew the Henderson family better than anyone. Margaret started documenting everything she could remember about the suspicious activities she had witnessed over the past few years. She made careful notes about Crawford's late-night visits, the times she had seen him in Robert's study without permission, and the occasions when important documents had gone missing and then mysteriously reappeared. The housekeeper also reached out to other staff members who had worked for the Henderson family. She spoke with the gardener who had noticed Crawford throwing papers into the mansion's incinerator on several occasions. The driver remembered taking Crawford to meetings that Robert supposedly attended, even though Robert had been home with the flu those days. As Margaret gathered this information, she realized the scope of Crawford's deception. He had been systematically framing Robert while covering his own tracks. Crawford knew Robert's routines, had access to his office, and understood exactly how to make the fraud look like Robert's work rather than his own. The weight of this knowledge pressed heavily on Margaret's shoulders. She held the key to Robert's innocence, but she was just a housekeeper. Would anyone believe her testimony against the word of prosecutors, investigators, and supposed victims? Would her loyalty to the Henderson family be seen as bias rather than truth? Despite her fears, Margaret knew she had to act. Robert Henderson had treated her like family for over 2 decades. He had helped her children get educations, supported her through difficult times, and always shown her respect and kindness. Now it was her turn to help him when he needed it most. The trial was scheduled to begin in just 3 weeks, and Margaret realized that time was running out to save an innocent man from spending the rest of his life in prison. In a small village, a cat named Whiskers discovered a magic fish in a pond. The fish promised 3 wishes in exchange for its freedom. Whiskers wished for endless fish, a cozy bed, and a bell that rang softly. The fish granted all 3 wishes and swam away, leaving Whiskers content and purring in the sun. Margaret spent sleepless nights going through every detail she could remember about James Crawford's behavior over the past 5 years. She created a timeline in a small notebook, writing down dates, times, and circumstances of every suspicious incident. Her handwriting was careful and precise, just like everything else she did. The first major breakthrough came when Margaret remembered the weekend Robert and Elizabeth had gone to their daughter's graduation ceremony at Harvard. Crawford had called the house claiming there was an emergency with one of their biggest investment projects. He said he needed to access Robert's private files immediately to prevent losing millions of dollars. Margaret had let Crawford into Robert's study that Saturday evening. She remembered feeling uncomfortable about it, but Crawford had seemed so urgent and worried. He spent hours in the office making phone calls and going through file cabinets. When Margaret brought him coffee, she noticed he was copying documents and seemed to be taking photos with his phone. Now Margaret realized that weekend was probably when Crawford had stolen the information he needed to set up the fake investment schemes. He had used Robert's client lists, copied his signature style, and gathered enough personal details about Robert's business practices to make the fraud look authentic. Margaret decided to visit some of the people who claimed Robert had stolen their money. She took a bus to the working-class neighborhood where Maria Santos lived. Maria had appeared on television saying Robert Henderson had taken her family's life savings of $50,000 for a fake apartment building project. When Margaret knocked on Maria's door, the elderly woman was surprised to see her. Margaret explained who she was and asked to hear Maria's story directly. As Maria talked, Margaret realized something important. Maria described meeting with a man who claimed to be Robert Henderson, but the description did not match Robert at all. The man Maria met was shorter than Robert, had brown eyes instead of blue, and spoke with a slight accent that Robert did not have. Maria showed Margaret a business card and brochures for the fake investment project. The business card had Robert's name and company information, but the photo was too blurry to make out clearly. Margaret visited 3 more supposed victims over the next few days. Each person described meeting with someone who looked different from Robert Henderson. The stories were similar. A man claiming to represent Henderson Enterprises had approached them with exclusive investment opportunities. He had promised guaranteed returns and pressured them to invest quickly before the opportunities disappeared. None of these people had ever been to Robert's office or the Henderson mansion. They had all met their supposed investor in coffee shops, restaurants, or small rented offices around the city. Margaret realized that Crawford must have been impersonating Robert or hiring someone else to do it, while using Robert's stolen business information. The most shocking discovery came when Margaret was cleaning Robert's study and found a hidden recording device behind one of his bookshelves. The small electronic device was still active, with a tiny red light blinking to show it was recording. Margaret carefully removed it, wrapped it in a cloth, and took it to an electronics store to find out what it was. The store clerk explained it was a high-tech listening device that could record conversations and transmit them to another location. He showed Margaret how someone could listen to everything said in that room using a smartphone app. Margaret realized Crawford had been spying on Robert's private conversations for months, possibly years. Armed with this new evidence, Margaret knew she had to contact Robert's lawyers. She called the law firm and asked to speak with David Chen, the lead attorney handling Robert's case. Chen was initially reluctant to meet with her, assuming she was just another witness who would testify about Robert's good character. When Margaret explained what she had discovered, Chen's attitude changed completely. He arranged to meet her that evening at his office, away from the reporters who were constantly watching the Henderson mansion. Margaret brought her notebook, the recording device, and copies of the fake business cards she had collected from the victims. Chen listened carefully as Margaret explained her theory about Crawford's involvement. He examined the evidence she had gathered and asked detailed questions about her observations. The lawyer was impressed by Margaret's thoroughness and attention to detail. He realized she had uncovered information that could completely change the direction of the case. The next challenge was proving that Crawford was responsible for the fraud. Chen explained that Margaret's evidence was compelling, but they needed more concrete proof that would convince a jury. They needed to catch Crawford in the act or find direct evidence linking him to the fake investments. Margaret suggested they investigate Crawford's financial records to see if he had been living beyond his means or making unusual deposits. Chen arranged for a private investigator to look into Crawford's background, while Margaret continued gathering information from her unique position in the Henderson household. The private investigator, Thomas Riley, was a former police detective who specialized in financial crimes. He discovered that Crawford had been gambling heavily at several casinos and owed significant amounts of money to dangerous people. Crawford's lifestyle had become increasingly expensive, with payments for luxury cars, expensive vacations, and designer clothing that his salary could not support. Riley also found that Crawford had opened several bank accounts under different names, using fake identification documents. These accounts had received large deposits that coincided with the times when victims claimed they had been defrauded. The money trail clearly showed Crawford was the real thief, not Robert Henderson. Margaret's role became even more crucial when Chen realized they needed to catch Crawford confessing to his crimes. The plan was risky, but it was their best chance to prove Robert's innocence before the trial began. Margaret would need to confront Crawford directly and try to get him to admit what he had done. The opportunity came when Crawford visited the Henderson mansion to discuss legal strategy with Robert. Margaret served coffee in the study and then pretended to leave while actually hiding in the adjacent room where she could hear their conversation. She held a small recording device that Chen had given her, hoping Crawford would say something incriminating. At first, Crawford maintained his innocent act, expressing sympathy for Robert's situation and offering to help in any way possible. But as their conversation continued, Margaret noticed Crawford becoming more nervous and agitated. He kept asking Robert about what evidence the prosecutors had and whether anyone suspected Crawford's involvement. Robert, still believing Crawford was his friend, mentioned that his legal team was investigating all possibilities and that they had found some interesting inconsistencies in the evidence. Crawford's voice became strained as he asked for more details about what they had discovered. Margaret knew this was her moment. She walked back into the study, carrying a fresh pot of coffee, and deliberately mentioned that she had been talking to some of the victims about their experiences. She said it was strange that none of them had actually met Robert in person. Crawford's face went pale when Margaret mentioned the victims. He quickly made an excuse about having another appointment and left the mansion hurriedly. Margaret had successfully planted doubt in his mind about how much they knew, and his nervous reaction was captured clearly on her recording device. That evening, Margaret met with Chen and Riley to review the recording. While Crawford had not made a full confession, his nervous responses and quick departure provided additional evidence of his guilt. Combined with the financial records, witness testimonies, and physical evidence Margaret had gathered, they now had a strong case to present to the court. The trial was set to begin in just 1 week, and Margaret knew that her testimony would be crucial to saving Robert Henderson's life and reputation. She prepared herself for the challenge of convincing a jury that a simple housekeeper had uncovered the truth that professional investigators had missed. The courthouse buzzed with activity as reporters, photographers, and curious onlookers gathered for what many expected to be the trial of the century. Robert Henderson, once respected as a successful businessman and philanthropist, now sat at the defendant's table facing charges that could send him to prison for the rest of his life. Margaret arrived early that Monday morning, wearing her best dress and carrying a folder containing all the evidence she had carefully collected. Her hands trembled slightly as she walked through the crowd of reporters shouting questions and taking pictures. She had never imagined that her quiet life as a housekeeper would lead her to testify in such a high-profile case. Inside the courtroom, Margaret saw Robert for the first time since the investigation began. He looked tired and older than his 55 years. His once confident posture was gone, replaced by the slumped shoulders of a man who had been fighting false accusations for months. When their eyes met, Robert gave her a small, grateful smile that reminded her why she was there. The prosecution team, led by District Attorney Patricia Holbrook, presented their case with confidence and theatrics. Holbrook was known for her aggressive courtroom style and her perfect record of convictions in high-profile fraud cases. She painted Robert as a greedy mastermind who had carefully planned and executed a scheme to steal millions of dollars from innocent victims. Holbrook's opening statement was powerful and convincing. She described how Robert Henderson had used his reputation and charm to gain the trust of hardworking families, then betrayed that trust by taking their life savings. She promised to present evidence that would prove beyond any doubt that Robert was guilty of fraud, conspiracy, and theft on a massive scale. The first witnesses called by the prosecution were the victims who claimed Robert had stolen their money. Maria Santos took the stand first, describing in emotional detail how she had saved for 30 years to have enough money to invest for her retirement. She tearfully explained how a man claiming to be Robert Henderson had convinced her to invest $50,000 in a luxury apartment building project that never existed. Margaret listened carefully as Maria testified, knowing that the elderly woman was telling the truth about being cheated, but was wrong about who had actually taken her money. The prosecution showed photos of Robert and asked Maria to confirm that he was the man who had taken her money. Maria squinted at the photos and said she believed it was him, though she admitted the lighting in the coffee shop where they met had been poor. 5 more victims testified over the next 2 days, each telling similar stories of being approached by someone claiming to represent Henderson Enterprises. The prosecution presented documents with Robert's forged signature, bank records showing money transferred from victim accounts to accounts supposedly controlled by Robert, and phone records that seemed to place Robert at meetings with victims. Defense attorney David Chen tried to poke holes in the prosecution's case during cross-examination, but the evidence seemed overwhelming. Several jurors were already looking at Robert with disgust and anger. Margaret watched from the gallery, knowing that she held the key information that could change everything, but growing increasingly worried that the jury would convict Robert before she had a chance to testify. The prosecution's star witness was James Crawford himself. He took the stand on Wednesday morning, looking appropriately serious and concerned. Crawford testified that he had worked closely with Robert for 8 years and had gradually noticed suspicious activities in their business dealings. Crawford, claimed that Robert had become increasingly secretive about certain investment projects. He said Robert had started excluding him from important meetings and had been making financial decisions without consulting the company's board of directors. Crawford painted himself as a concerned business partner who had tried to question Robert's methods but had been shut out of the decision-making process. Margaret felt her blood pressure rise as she listened to Crawford's lies. She knew every word was false, but he delivered his testimony with such conviction that even she might have believed him if she did not know the truth. Crawford described discovering discrepancies in company accounts and finding evidence that Robert was using client money for personal expenses. The most damaging part of Crawford's testimony came when he claimed he had tried to confront Robert about the suspicious activities. Crawford said Robert had threatened to destroy his career and reputation if he spoke to anyone about what he had discovered. He portrayed himself as a reluctant witness who only came forward because his conscience would not allow him to stay silent, while innocent people suffered. During cross-examination, Chen challenged Crawford's timeline and questioned why he had waited so long to report his suspicions to authorities. Crawford claimed he had been afraid of Robert's threats and had needed time to gather enough evidence to protect himself. His answers seemed reasonable to most people in the courtroom, and Margaret could see that some jurors were sympathizing with him. By Thursday afternoon, the prosecution rested their case, feeling confident they had proven Robert's guilt beyond any reasonable doubt. The evidence seemed to clearly show that Robert Henderson had orchestrated an elaborate fraud scheme that had stolen over $2 million from victims who trusted him with their life savings. Chen began the defense case by calling character witnesses who testified about Robert's honesty, integrity, and charitable work in the community. Local business leaders, charity organization directors, and longtime friends all spoke about Robert's reputation for fairness and his history of helping others. While their testimony was positive, it did not directly address the specific charges against him. Margaret's moment finally came on Friday morning when Chen called her to the witness stand. She walked slowly to the front of the courtroom, feeling the weight of everyone's eyes upon her. The court clerk administered the oath, and Margaret promised to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. Chen began by establishing Margaret's credibility and her long relationship with the Henderson family. She explained her daily responsibilities, her access to Robert's private office, and her opportunity to observe his business activities over many years. Margaret spoke clearly and confidently about Robert's character and work habits. Then Chen began asking about Margaret's observations of James Crawford. Margaret described the late-night visits when Robert was not home, the times she had seen Crawford going through Robert's files without permission, and the occasions when important documents had disappeared and then mysteriously reappeared. The courtroom atmosphere changed as Margaret testified about finding the hidden recording device in Robert's study. She explained how she had discovered it, what the electronics store clerk had told her about its capabilities, and how long it might have been there recording private conversations. Margaret then described her visits to the fraud victims and how their descriptions of the man who had taken their money did not match Robert's appearance. She presented the fake business cards she had collected and explained the inconsistencies she had noticed in the prosecution's timeline of events. The most dramatic moment came when Margaret testified about her confrontation with Crawford in Robert's study. She described how Crawford had become nervous and agitated when she mentioned talking to the victims, and how he had quickly left the mansion after learning that they were investigating inconsistencies in the evidence. Prosecutor Holbrook's cross-examination was aggressive and hostile. She tried to portray Margaret as a loyal employee who would say anything to protect her employer. Holbrook suggested that Margaret was making up stories to help Robert avoid conviction, and that her testimony was biased and unreliable. Margaret remained calm and composed during the harsh questioning. She answered each question honestly, and provided specific details about dates, times, and circumstances that supported her testimony. When Holbrook asked why Margaret had waited so long to come forward with this information, Margaret explained that she had not understood the significance of what she had observed until she began investigating the case herself. The cross-examination continued for over an hour, with Holbrook trying every angle to discredit Margaret's testimony. But Margaret's sincerity and attention to detail made her story compelling and believable. Several jurors were taking careful notes, and Margaret could see doubt beginning to appear on their faces. As Margaret stepped down from the witness stand, she felt a mixture of relief and anxiety. She had told the truth as clearly and completely as possible, but she did not know if it would be enough to save Robert Henderson from a wrongful conviction. Following Margaret's powerful testimony, David Chen called private investigator Thomas Riley to the stand. Riley presented his findings about James Crawford's secret bank accounts, gambling debts, and financial difficulties. He explained how Crawford had been living far beyond his legitimate income and had received large deposits that coincided with the dates when victims claimed they had been defrauded. Riley's testimony was methodical and professional. He showed bank records proving that Crawford had opened multiple accounts under false names and had been moving money through a complex network designed to hide the paper trail. The investigator explained how Crawford's gambling addiction had put him in debt to dangerous people who demanded immediate payment. The defense team then presented handwriting analysis evidence. Expert witness Dr. Sarah Mitchell had examined the supposedly fraudulent documents that contained Robert's signature. Using high-powered microscopes and advanced analysis techniques, Dr. Mitchell demonstrated that the signatures had been forged by someone who had studied Robert's handwriting carefully, but could not perfectly replicate the subtle pressure, patterns, and natural flow of his actual signature. Dr. Mitchell's testimony was technical but convincing. She showed enlarged photographs of genuine Robert Henderson signatures compared to the forged ones found on the fraudulent investment documents. The differences were clear when viewed under magnification, though they would have been difficult to detect without expert analysis. Chen also called technology expert Michael Foster to explain the hidden recording device that Margaret had discovered. Foster testified about how the device worked, how long it could record conversations, and how the recordings could be transmitted to an external location. He confirmed that someone could have been listening to Robert's private business conversations for months without being detected. The courtroom drama intensified when Chen made a surprise announcement. He requested that the court issue a warrant to search James Crawford's residence and personal belongings for additional evidence. Chen argued that Margaret's testimony and Riley's investigation provided probable cause to believe that Crawford was the real perpetrator of the fraud scheme. Prosecutor Holbrook objected strongly to this request, arguing that it was a desperate attempt by the defense to create reasonable doubt by blaming someone else without solid proof. She claimed that Crawford was a respected businessman who had courageously come forward to expose Robert's crimes, and that searching his property would be harassment of a key prosecution. Witness. Judge Harrison Williams considered both arguments carefully before ruling that there was sufficient evidence to justify a limited search of Crawford's home and office. The judge ordered police detectives to look specifically for documents related to the fraud case, evidence of impersonation, or any materials that might support the defense theory. The search took place over the weekend while the jury was sequestered. Detectives found a treasure trove of incriminating evidence in Crawford's home office. Hidden in a locked filing cabinet were photocopies of Robert's business documents, practice sheets where Crawford had been forging Robert's signature, and detailed notes about each victim's financial situation and personal background. Most damning was a collection of fake identification documents and business cards with Robert's name and company information. The police also found a computer containing hundreds of recorded conversations from the hidden device in Robert's study, proving that Crawford had been conducting industrial espionage for months. Perhaps most shocking was the discovery of a detailed written plan describing how Crawford intended to frame Robert for the fraud while positioning himself to take over Henderson Enterprises after Robert's conviction. The plan included strategies for approaching victims, methods for forging documents, and contingency plans for dealing with potential complications. When court resumed on Monday morning, the atmosphere had completely changed. News of the search and its findings had leaked to the media, and reporters were now questioning whether Robert Henderson was actually innocent of the charges against him. The prosecution team looked stunned and unprepared as Chen presented the newly discovered evidence to the jury. Chen called Detective Rodriguez, who had conducted the search, to testify about what they had found in Crawford's possession. The detective described each piece of evidence in detail, explaining how it supported the theory that Crawford was the real perpetrator of the fraud scheme. The impact on the jury was immediate and obvious, with several members looking shocked and confused. The most dramatic moment came when Chen announced that he was calling James Crawford back to the witness stand. Crawford, who had been confident and composed during his initial testimony, now looked pale and nervous as he was sworn in again. His lawyer, who had been sitting in the gallery, quickly approached the bench to request that Crawford be allowed to invoke his Fifth Amendment right against self-incrimination. Judge Williams ruled that Crawford could not refuse to testify since he had already given testimony in the case and was not currently facing criminal charges. However, the judge warned Crawford that anything he said could potentially be used against him in future legal proceedings. Chen's cross-examination of Crawford was methodical and devastating. He presented each piece of evidence found in Crawford's home and asked him to explain it. Crawford's answers became increasingly desperate and contradictory as Chen systematically dismantled his credibility. When shown the practice sheets with Robert's forged signature, Crawford claimed he had been trying to help investigators by showing how someone might forge Robert's handwriting. When presented with the fake identification documents, Crawford said he had no idea how they had gotten into his filing cabinet. His explanations became more implausible with each question. The breaking point came when Chen played one of the recorded conversations from Crawford's computer. The recording clearly showed Crawford listening in on a private conversation between Robert and his lawyer about trial strategy. When confronted with this evidence, Crawford finally broke down and demanded to speak with his attorney. Judge Williams called a recess while Crawford consulted with his lawyer. During the break, Margaret watched from the gallery as Crawford huddled with his legal counsel, both of them looking increasingly panicked. The prosecution team was also in crisis mode, realizing that their star witness had just been exposed as potentially the real criminal. When court resumed, Crawford's attorney announced that his client would be invoking his Fifth Amendment rights and would not answer any further questions. The damage, however, had already been done. Crawford's refusal to explain the evidence found in his possession spoke volumes to the jury about his guilt. Chen then called expert witness Dr. Amanda Porter, a forensic accountant who had analyzed the financial records related to the fraud case. Dr. Porter testified that the money trail clearly showed the stolen funds flowing into Crawford's secret bank accounts rather than any accounts controlled by Robert Henderson. Dr. Porter's analysis was comprehensive and convincing. She showed how Crawford had used his access to Robert's business information to create convincing fake investment opportunities, then funneled the victim's money into his own accounts while creating false records to make it appear that Robert was responsible. The forensic accountant also testified about Crawford's financial difficulties and how the timing of the fraud coincided with his gambling debts and pressure from creditors. She explained that Crawford had clear motive, means, and opportunity to commit the crimes for which Robert was being prosecuted. Margaret felt a sense of justice as she watched the case unfold. Her careful observations and courageous decision to investigate had uncovered the truth that professional investigators had missed. The evidence was now overwhelming that James Crawford was the real criminal, and that Robert Henderson was an innocent man who had been betrayed by someone he trusted. As the defense rested their case, Margaret could see that the atmosphere in the courtroom had completely shifted. The jury members who had earlier looked at Robert with suspicion and anger were now regarding him with sympathy and concern. The prosecution's seemingly airtight case had been completely demolished by the evidence that Margaret's investigation had uncovered. The stage was set for closing arguments that would determine whether Robert Henderson would spend the rest of his life in prison or walk free as an innocent man who had been the victim of an elaborate betrayal by his trusted business partner. The courtroom was packed beyond capacity for closing arguments. Media representatives from across the country had descended upon Boston to cover what had become one of the most shocking reversals in legal history. Margaret sat in the front row of the gallery, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, as she prepared to hear the final arguments that would determine Robert Henderson's fate. Prosecutor Patricia Holbrook rose to deliver the prosecution's closing argument, but her usual confidence was gone. The evidence that had seemed so strong just a week earlier had been completely undermined by the defense's revelations about James Crawford's deception. Holbrook faced the nearly impossible task of convincing the jury that Robert was still guilty despite the overwhelming evidence pointing to Crawford as the real perpetrator. Holbrook attempted to argue that Robert and Crawford had been working together in the fraud scheme, and that Crawford's betrayal of Robert was simply a falling out among thieves. She suggested that Robert had been the mastermind while Crawford was merely a tool who had been discarded when the scheme began to unravel. The prosecutor pointed to Robert's wealth and success, arguing that he had the most to gain from the fraudulent investments. She reminded the jury that Robert had access to all the business information that was used to deceive the victims, and that his signature appeared on many of the fraudulent documents, even if they were later proven to be forgeries. Holbrook's argument felt desperate and unconvincing. She was asking the jury to ignore the mountain of evidence that had emerged during the defense case and to continue believing in a theory that no longer made sense given the new facts. Her closing statement lasted less than an hour, and she seemed relieved when it was over. David Chen's closing argument was masterful in its clarity and emotional power. He began by thanking Margaret Williams for her courage in coming forward with the truth, even when it meant risking her own livelihood and reputation. Chen described Margaret as a hero who had prevented a terrible miscarriage of justice through her careful observations and relentless pursuit of the truth. Chen methodically walked the jury through the evidence that proved Robert's innocence and Crawford's guilt. He showed how Crawford had systematically planned and executed the fraud scheme while positioning Robert to take the blame. The defense attorney explained how Crawford's gambling addiction and financial desperation had motivated him to betray his business partner and friend. The most powerful part of Chen's closing was his description of the impact the false accusations had on Robert and his family. He talked about how Robert's reputation had been destroyed, his business had been ruined, and his health had suffered under the stress of fighting charges for crimes he did not commit. Chen reminded the jury that Robert was not just a defendant, but also a victim of Crawford's elaborate deception. Chen concluded his argument by asking the jury to imagine how they would feel if they were falsely accused of terrible crimes and faced spending the rest of their lives in prison for something they did not do. He urged them to look at the evidence objectively and to have the courage to admit that the prosecution had charged the wrong man. As the jury retired to begin deliberations, Margaret felt emotionally drained. The past month had been an incredible journey from her quiet life as a housekeeper to the center of a major legal drama. She had discovered evidence that professional investigators had missed, confronted a dangerous criminal, and testified in front of the entire world. Now all she could do was wait and hope that her efforts had been enough to save an innocent man. The jury deliberated for 3 days. Margaret spent those days at home, unable to concentrate on anything except wondering what the jurors were thinking and whether they believed her testimony. She received phone calls from reporters wanting to interview her, but she politely declined all requests. She had said everything she needed to say in court, and now it was time to let the legal system work. On Thursday afternoon, the jury sent word that they had reached a verdict. Margaret arrived at the courthouse to find crowds of people waiting outside, including many of the fraud victims who had come to hear the decision. The atmosphere was tense and electric as everyone filed into the courtroom for the final act of the drama. Robert Henderson sat at the defense table looking calm but tired. His wife Elizabeth held his hand while their children Michael and Sarah sat behind them with tears in their eyes. Margaret could see the strain that the entire ordeal had put on the family, and she prayed that their nightmare was about to end. Judge Williams called the court to order and asked the jury foreman to stand and deliver the verdict. The foreman, a middle-aged man who had worked as a factory supervisor, looked directly at Robert as he spoke. The courtroom was completely silent except for the sound of camera shutters clicking as photographers captured the historic moment. On the charge of fraud in the first degree, we find the defendant Robert Henderson not guilty, the foreman announced clearly. The courtroom erupted in gasps, cheers, and sobs as the first verdict was read. Margaret felt tears streaming down her face as 23 years of loyalty and trust were finally vindicated. The foreman continued reading the verdicts for each of the remaining charges: conspiracy, theft, money laundering, and racketeering. Each verdict was the same: not guilty. Robert Henderson had been completely exonerated of all charges against him. As the final verdict was read, Robert collapsed into his chair with relief and exhaustion. His family surrounded him with embraces while his legal team shook hands and exchanged congratulations. Margaret watched from the gallery as Robert looked around the courtroom until his eyes found hers. He mouthed the words "thank you" with tears in his eyes, and Margaret nodded back, feeling a deep sense of satisfaction that justice had finally been served. Judge Williams thanked the jury for their service and dismissed them with praise for their careful consideration of a complex case. He then addressed the courtroom, acknowledging that the case had revealed serious flaws in the initial investigation and expressing regret that an innocent man had been forced to endure months of false accusations. As people began filing out of the courtroom, Margaret noticed several of the fraud victims approaching Robert's family. Maria Santos, the elderly woman who had lost her life savings, walked up to Robert with tears in her eyes. She apologized for identifying him as the man who had stolen her money, explaining that she now understood she had been deceived by someone who was impersonating him. Robert graciously accepted her apology and assured her that he understood she was also a victim of Crawford's crimes. He promised that he would do everything in his power to help recover the money that had been stolen from her and the other victims. The conversation was emotional and healing for everyone involved. Outside the courthouse, reporters surrounded Margaret as she tried to make her way to her car. They shouted questions about how she had uncovered the evidence that proved Robert's innocence and what had motivated her to investigate the case on her own. Margaret paused briefly to make a statement to the gathered media. "Mr. Henderson is a good man who has always treated me and my family with kindness and respect," Margaret said simply. "When I saw him being accused of things I knew he could never do, I had to speak up for the truth. I'm just glad that justice was served and that the real criminal will be held accountable for his actions." The reporters pressed for more details, but Margaret declined to elaborate further. She had never sought publicity or recognition for her actions, and she was eager to return to her normal life now that the ordeal was over. As she drove home, Margaret reflected on the incredible journey that had brought her from the Henderson mansion to the witness stand of a major criminal trial. The next morning, Margaret woke up to find her phone ringing constantly with interview requests from television shows, magazines, and book publishers. Everyone wanted to hear her story and understand how a housekeeper had managed to solve a case that had stumped professional investigators. Margaret politely declined all the offers, preferring to maintain her privacy. Later that day, Robert Henderson called Margaret personally to invite her and her family to dinner at the mansion. When Margaret arrived that evening, she found the entire Henderson family waiting to thank her for saving Robert's life and reputation. The atmosphere was joyful and celebratory, a stark contrast to the dark months when the family had lived under the shadow of false accusations. Over dinner, Robert explained how grateful he was for Margaret's loyalty and courage. He told her that most people in her position would have assumed he was guilty and distanced themselves from the family to protect their own reputations. Instead, Margaret had risked everything to investigate the truth and fight for his innocence. Robert announced that he was promoting Margaret to head of household operations and giving her a substantial raise in recognition of her extraordinary service to the family. He also established a college scholarship fund in her name to help other hard-working people pursue their educational dreams, just as she had helped her own children achieve theirs. Margaret was touched by Robert's generosity, but she insisted that she had only done what was right. She explained that after 23 years of working for the Henderson family, she could not stand by and watch an innocent man be destroyed by lies and deception. Her actions had been motivated by loyalty, friendship, and a simple belief in doing the right thing. As the evening progressed, the conversation turned to James Crawford and what would happen to him next. Robert's lawyers had already been in contact with the district attorney's office about pressing charges against Crawford for fraud, perjury, and conspiracy. The evidence that had emerged during the trial made it clear that Crawford was the real criminal, and he would likely face many years in prison for his crimes. Robert admitted that Crawford's betrayal had been the most painful part of the entire ordeal. He had trusted Crawford as both a business partner and a friend, never suspecting that his colleague was secretly planning to destroy him. The betrayal had taught Robert to be more careful about who he trusted, but he was determined not to let Crawford's actions make him cynical about human nature. The dinner ended with Robert making a toast to Margaret's courage and integrity. He raised his glass and said that Margaret had not only saved his freedom and reputation, but had also restored his faith in the goodness of people. The entire family joined in the toast, celebrating a woman whose quiet strength and determination had prevented a terrible miscarriage of justice. As Margaret drove home that night, she felt a deep sense of peace and satisfaction. The nightmare was finally over, and an innocent man was free to rebuild his life and reputation. Justice had been served, and the real criminal would face the consequences of his actions. Margaret had proven that sometimes the most important truths come from the most unexpected sources, and that courage and integrity can triumph over deception and betrayal. 6 months after Robert Henderson's acquittal, James Crawford sat in a federal courthouse facing his own criminal trial. The evidence that Margaret Williams had uncovered during her investigation formed the foundation of the prosecution's case against him. Crawford had been charged with multiple counts of fraud, conspiracy, perjury, and identity theft. The trial proceeded quickly, as Crawford's guilt was undeniable given the mountain of evidence found in his possession. The fake identification documents, forged signatures, recorded conversations, and financial records painted a clear picture of his elaborate scheme to frame Robert Henderson while stealing millions of dollars from innocent victims. Margaret testified again, this time as a prosecution witness against Crawford. Her testimony was even more powerful than it had been during Robert's trial, as she was now able to provide additional details about Crawford's suspicious behavior that she had remembered over the intervening months. Crawford's defense attorney tried to argue that his client had been mentally ill and suffering from gambling addiction when he committed the crimes. The lawyer claimed that Crawford's actions were the result of desperation and poor judgment, rather than calculated criminal intent. However, the detailed planning documents found in Crawford's home office clearly showed that his scheme had been carefully thought out over many months. The jury deliberated for less than 6 hours before returning guilty verdicts on all charges. Crawford was sentenced to 25 years in federal prison and ordered to pay full restitution to his victims. The judge described Crawford's crimes as a betrayal of trust that had not only harmed innocent victims, but had also nearly destroyed the life of an innocent man. During the sentencing hearing, several of the fraud victims spoke about the impact Crawford's crimes had on their lives. Maria Santos tearfully described how losing her life savings had forced her to move in with her daughter and give up her independence. Other victims talked about the stress, anxiety, and financial hardship they had endured because of Crawford's deception. Robert Henderson also spoke at the sentencing hearing, describing the months of hell he had endured while fighting false accusations. He talked about the damage to his reputation, the destruction of his business relationships, and the emotional toll on his family. Robert's voice was calm but firm as he told the court that Crawford's actions had been a calculated attempt to destroy his life. Margaret chose not to speak at the sentencing hearing, feeling that she had already said everything necessary during her testimony. She watched from the gallery as Crawford was led away in handcuffs, finally being held accountable for his crimes. The sight brought her a sense of closure and justice. Following Crawford's conviction, Robert Henderson worked tirelessly to help the fraud victims recover their stolen money. He hired forensic accountants to trace the funds through Crawford's complex network of bank accounts and investments. While not all of the money could be recovered, Robert's efforts helped return over 60% of the stolen funds to their rightful owners. Robert also established a victim assistance fund using his own money to help those who had lost the most. He felt a moral obligation to help these people, even though he had been as much a victim of Crawford's scheme as they were. The fund provided interest-free loans and grants to help victims rebuild their financial security. Margaret's role in exposing Crawford's crimes made her something of a celebrity, though she continued to avoid most media attention. She was invited to speak at law enforcement conferences about the importance of paying attention to details and trusting instincts when something seems wrong. Her story became a case study in criminal justice programs about how ordinary citizens can play crucial roles in uncovering the truth. The Henderson family's relationship with Margaret grew even stronger. In the months following the trial, Robert and Elizabeth treated her more like a family member than an employee, often seeking her advice on important decisions and including her in family celebrations. Margaret's children were welcomed into the Henderson home as honored guests whenever they visited. Margaret's son, David, who had just graduated from college with the help of Robert's scholarship program, decided to pursue a career in law enforcement inspired by his mother's detective work. Her daughter, Sarah, enrolled in a criminal justice program, hoping to become a prosecutor who could help other innocent people fight false accusations. The case also led to significant changes in how fraud investigations were conducted. Law enforcement agencies began paying more attention to insider threats and the possibility that accusers might actually be the real perpetrators. Margaret's discovery of the hidden recording device led to new protocols for checking for surveillance equipment in corporate espionage cases. Robert Henderson slowly rebuilt his business reputation and relationships in the months following his vindication. Many of his former business partners and friends apologized for doubting him and welcomed him back into their professional circles. However, Robert was more selective about who he trusted and implemented stronger security measures to protect against future betrayals. The Henderson family decided to establish the Margaret Williams Foundation for Justice, a nonprofit organization dedicated to helping people who had been falsely accused of crimes they did not commit. The foundation provided legal assistance, investigative resources, and emotional support to individuals fighting wrongful prosecutions. Margaret was deeply honored when Robert asked her to serve on the foundation's board of directors. She accepted the position, seeing it as an opportunity to help other people who found themselves in situations similar to what Robert had experienced. The foundation's work became an important part of Margaret's life as she continued working for the Henderson family. 2 years after the trials ended, Margaret was awarded the Citizens Medal of Honor by the Mayor of Boston for her courage in exposing Crawford's crimes and preventing a wrongful conviction. The ceremony was attended by hundreds of people, including many of the fraud victims whose money had been recovered thanks to Margaret's investigation. In her acceptance speech, Margaret emphasized that she had simply done what anyone should do when they witness injustice. She urged others to speak up when they see something wrong, even if it seems easier to stay silent. Margaret's story had inspired countless people to trust their instincts and stand up for truth and justice. The case became the subject of a best-selling book and a television documentary that aired on national television. Margaret cooperated with both projects, hoping that her story would encourage other people to get involved when they witness wrongdoing. She donated her proceeds from the book to the Victim Assistance Fund that Robert had established. Robert Henderson's business eventually recovered and grew larger than ever before. His experience with false accusations made him more empathetic to others who faced challenges and injustices. He became a major philanthropist, supporting causes related to criminal justice reform, legal aid for the poor, and protection for whistleblowers. Margaret Williams continued working for the Henderson family for many more years, eventually retiring at the age of 65 with a generous pension that ensured her financial security. Her courage and integrity had not only saved an innocent man from prison but had also led to the conviction of a real criminal and the recovery of millions of dollars for fraud victims. The story of Margaret Williams became a powerful reminder that heroism often comes from unexpected places. A quiet housekeeper with no formal education in law or investigation had accomplished what trained professionals had failed to do. Her success came from paying attention to details, trusting her instincts, and having the courage to act when she witnessed injustice. Margaret's legacy lived on through the foundation that bore her name, and the many people whose lives had been changed by her actions. She had proven that one person's courage and determination could make a difference in the world, and that the truth will ultimately prevail when good people are willing to fight for it.